Hello, and welcome everyone to the 16th webinar in Contact's Produce Safety webinar series and the finale of Season 2. The second season continues to tackle fresh produce safety topics chosen every month through a dynamic webinar series that will continue to bring together industry, academia, and regulatory minds to solve some of the produce industry's biggest and most timely challenges. This series is part of a larger industry outreach and risk mitigation project called CONTACT, or Scientific Challenges and Cost-Effective Management of Risks Associated with Implementation of Produce Safety Regulations. This project is supported by the Specialty Crops Research Initiative from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This webinar series, coupled with other research and extension efforts, is part of a collaborative effort across 10 different universities and government institutions to enhance produce safety knowledge and compliance across the industry. We are so grateful to our collaborators for their efforts and support of this webinar series. Their logos can be seen on the screen. This multi-year webinar series will start back up again in September of 2023 for Season 3, and we plan to address brand new content chosen by you. There are still some open slots for the next volume of webinars, so if there are topics you want to hear more about and that are not on the list, please let us know in the comments, webinar surveys, or on our social media pages. Also, Contact has launched an ag water survey. So if you're an educator, tell us what you think about Subpart E. If you're a grower, a packer, and you're dealing with agricultural water, tell us, give us comments, thoughts. What do you think about Subpart E on ag water? As I said, the Contact team has launched an industry survey on pre-harvest ag water. So help us learn about you. You can participate now. I will make sure I include this QR code in the follow-up email that has the webinar recording. While the webinar series lets us meet with you once a month, you know what I'm going to say, that's just not enough for us. So we'd love to hashtag make contact with you about today's webinar or other produce safety news and research on our Twitter and Instagram pages. You can follow us on these platforms at PS_SCI. And also, while we won't be having the webinar series this summer, we are going to launch our first semi-annual recap. So you will get a lot of really good short burst quick content. So stay tuned for that. We're really excited about it. And so is Batman. Be sure to check out the Contact website and the YouTube page for more produce safety resources, including our key takeaway documents, webinar recordings, and much more. You can subscribe to our page to get instant notifications of content like our mini webinars. A quick reminder for today, if you would like to submit a question for our speaker during or before the Q&A session, please submit your questions through the Q&A box and not the chat box. Now let's welcome our speaker today. Dr. Michele Jay-Russell is a research microbiologist and faculty member at the University of California, Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. She started her career as an epidemiologist, where she gained 15 years of experience in infectious disease surveillance, foodborne disease outbreak investigation, and public health education. In her current position as manager of the Western Center for Food Safety, she oversees a collaborative research program that aims to understand the role of wildlife and domesticated animals in the dissemination of zoonotic enteric foodborne pathogens in the produce production environment, pathogen risks associated with biological soil amendments of animal origin, and an outreach educational program that promotes good agricultural practices and co-management of food safety and environmental resources on different scale farms. I know as a student and a scientist today, I really respect a lot about Michele Jay-Russell's research and her communication style. So we are so blessed to have you. Welcome, Michele. The floor is yours.
Oh, Laura, thanks so much for the nice introduction. And I'm really excited to be with everyone today. And this Contact project has been just a really wonderful experience as a scientist and interacting with colleagues and the good work that we're doing. And I think this time will fit in well to end up your season 2. There might be a sequel at some point because this is a new initiative, a somewhat new initiative that I'm going to talk about in California that's also heavily influenced by our collaborators in industry who could not make it today for the presentation, but I'm definitely borrowing some slides and want to give some acknowledgement to our counterparts over in the California Department of Food and Agriculture, Natalie Kraut-Greenberg and Norm Groot at the Monterey County Farm Bureau, who very generously shared some of their slides for part of my talk that addresses the Won't You Be My Neighbor, our California Agriculture Neighbor initiative. So I'm going to jump in. I believe questions will come at the end and when we have a discussion period. And I do have a couple of videos to show after the slides. So just to start out, I want to say I know this is probably an international audience, and so maybe not everyone is familiar with California's agriculture industry, but it is quite huge. We have over almost 70,000 farms and ranches, 24.3 million acres that are devoted to farming and ranching. And these are intermixed with urban and rural areas, but our state is big. And 21,000 of those farms are actually covered by the produce safety rule under FSMA. And there's more than 400 commodities growing, with a subset of those being covered under the produce safety rule. So a $49 billion industry, it's just incredibly important to our economy, as well as the fact that California helps to feed the nation and beyond, in particular, leafy greens, which is the main topic today for this presentation. In fact, 76% of United States lettuce is grown in California, and this represents $2 billion in annual cash receipts. It's the number 8 commodity in California is actually lettuce, all lettuce. And much of that is actually growing in the Central Coast, but seasonally, the industry shifts to Southern California and Arizona. For a number of reasons that I'll explain, I'll be focusing mostly on the leafy green industry in the Central Coast for this particular presentation. A little bit about the California Central Coast. First of all, it's beautiful. If you are in the area and have not been there, please contact one of us from the industry or university or government, and we can certainly get you some tours. The Central Coast has been called the Salad Bowl of the Nation. It's John Steinbeck territory. If you liked East of Eden, and his books are often in the setting in our Central Coast, which is home to major specialty crops, especially lettuce and other leafy greens, strawberries and artichokes, but much more too. And it is located south of San Francisco and southwest of UC Davis. So it's about 3-4 hour drive from Davis, depending on traffic. So it's reasonable to do research in that area. We also do research in the desert growing area of Imperial Valley in Arizona, which primarily focuses on the winter, early spring crops. We are currently going into transition from the Southern California to the Central Coast, and the Central Coast this year was heavily impacted by flooding. 2 really large, almost unprecedented storms, one in January and one in March with levee breaks. And we have, unfortunately, a lot of farming area that was flooded and currently is fallow while there are evaluations on the implications of that flooding. But it is a reality of this area. Interestingly enough, though, I want to say too, is that the growing season on the Central Coast is in the later spring, summer, into early fall, when it's very dry. We get all of our rain in one big bunch during the winter time, generally December to about March. And we might not have a drop of rain in between. So there is no actual runoff from rain happening during the growing season, but there's obviously concerns of how the soil and other inputs could be affected by these flooding. And a big focus, I know one of the early webinars, I think Trevor talked about adjacent land use, and this theme comes up. This essentially comes out of a lot of his research and other research looking at animal agriculture and juxtaposition as well as other types of agriculture, such as composters, vineyards, and as well as the interface, the urban-suburban interface. So you have these adjacent land uses and a lot of focus. If you follow our issues with romaine lettuce and E. coli 0157, we'll see that there's a lot of focus on cattle. And it's really important. I'll probably say it more than once. In the Central Coast, we have almost no feedlots. I think one or two dairies that are pretty small. Oh, it's almost entirely cow-calf, and the density has been decreasing instead of increasing. The cow-calf operators have had a really hard time with drought before we had all these storms because there was no feed. And so despite the heavy concern about the cattle that are mostly on the hillsides, we really, it's a low density non-feedlot situation, which is in contrast to what you might see in Arizona. Is my slide. So the Salinas Valley is somewhat the same as referring to the Central Coast, but it's really more in Monterey County specifically. And you have the Salinas River that runs actually from south to north, which is interesting, and a lot of just really fertile land to grow all those specialty crops, as well as wonderful riparian corridors, wildlife habitat, and again, the rangeland cow-calf operations that are on the hillsides. So that's all the good news about California. The bad news is that we have been plagued with multiple outbreaks that have been traced back to California growing leafy greens. Most recently, there have been several outbreaks linked to romaine lettuce that was growing in that Salinas Valley region, and a number of CDC and FDA reports that have received a lot of media attention. And if you look back, again, remember that over 70% of the lettuce comes from this region. So you're obviously going to have some amount of bias toward lettuce growing in that region. But even that being said, it is out of proportion in terms of, this is a paper that came out of the California Department of Public Health, where I used to work on the first half of my career before going into academia. And they analyzed leafy green vehicle types that were associated with confirmed incidents that were linked to California. And in this table 3 in the paper, they actually broke down a number of different food sources, suspected vehicles, and 66% of these food safety incidents, which also included complaints and recalls, not just illnesses and outbreaks, they were linked to lettuce and spinach. That's very disproportionate to these other sources. And of those leafy greens, 98% of the lettuce were of 3 types: romaine, iceberg, and leaf. And there's been a lot of looking into romaine and some of the aspects of that particular cultivar, why it might be more prone to contamination. And there was a USDA NIFA workshop that was really interesting right before COVID, looking at plant breeding. Would there be a way to create a variety of lettuce that would be more resistant to this pathogen produce type pair that keeps reoccurring in lettuce and leafy greens? I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but just again, assuming that maybe not everyone knows about our industry in California and Arizona, we do have a leafy green marketing agreement that was formulated right after the 2006 large E. coli 0157 outbreak that was linked to bagged baby spinach growing in the Central Coast, and a couple other outbreaks that occurred with lettuce during that year. Really galvanized the industry and brought together a lot of experts to develop the best food safety practices. And so this is what we're talking when I say leafy greens. And you can find any of that in the resources, which I will give to Laura and Alexis afterward in case you want to read more of these links. But again, I talked early on, I borrowed some CDFA slides on how important the economy is, how important leafy greens are to our economy. I was involved in the 2006 investigation on the Central Coast on the farm side. And this is just a reminder, a slide, a bit of history. This was taken in October 2006 when all of the teams went down to investigate the outbreak. And the local bagel shop had a sign up that they're currently not using spinach. In fact, if you went to the grocery store next door, you would find that all spinach had been removed from the shelves, even frozen spinach at that stage, because FDA and CDC did not know the origin of where the spinach had come from, although the Central Coast was highly suspected early on because that's where most of the spinach was being shipped. So fast forward, it seemed like the LGMA, all the efforts, the tremendous amount of research through USDA, NIFA, and the Center for Produce Safety, commodity boards. They're just a huge effort in California that has since expanded. And then, of course, having the produce safety rule roll out, one would think we would no longer still be having these issues with leafy greens, but we do. I think we would have a lot more problems if it weren't for all those efforts, but we still have a baseline issue that seems to come up often seasonally in the fall. And I have this slide here just to point out that in 2006, there were a lot of environmental samples, and I'll briefly mention that. But there have also been intensive investigations that have gone back to the farm for these recent romaine lettuce outbreaks, both in Yuma, Arizona, Imperial Valley, as well as at the Central Coast. And a common theme that has popped up in these recent reports is that, just to quote that from FDA, we're calling on leafy green growers to assess and mitigate risks associated with adjacent and nearby land uses, including grazing lands and animal operations. So that immediately puts the farmers, our neighbors, into a dilemma, because basically an industry, the cattle industry, that has no oversight by FDA, as it shouldn't. They are having their own best practices, but they're not related to produce safety. Yet the produce industry has to address these findings from the outbreaks. And here, this is a picture from the investigation report from fall of 2020. Again, putting the dots of positive, the outbreak strain positives from that 2019 outbreak right into the hills, not where the produce was grown, but where the cattle were located. The exact mechanism, given the setbacks and the low density of the cattle in these hills, make it still really unclear of what the transport mechanisms are. And thus, we're doing a lot of research, but without knowing. Most of the rest of my talk is going to say what California Department of Food and Agriculture, the industry, and academia has been doing to come together to try to do something proactive without having all the scientific answers yet. And another twist in this is that we're seeing these recurring outbreaks with these strains that the CDC calls REP. They are reoccurring, emerging, persistent strains. And it's fairly unusual, I think, for E. coli 0157 to come back in an area year after year. You would think there would be mutations, but with whole genome sequencing, these very closely related strains, one that was seen in Yuma, and then this other Rep2 strain that's been seen on the Central Coast. There's a lot of questions. Is it hiding out in a niche? Is it coming back by reintroduction by animals or water sources? But just drawing this to your attention, not to get overly complicated, but it puts this into the realm of an emerging pathogen. And that makes it extra challenging to understand that all of the epidemiology. That's just not as simple as from point A to B. This is beyond cow poo to romaine lettuce. There's a lot of factors that are going on that we haven't totally understood. And I am a veterinarian by original training, as well as epidemiologist, as mentioned in the bio. And a big concept is One Health, and that's the idea of animals, humans, and the environment. And all of these are intertwined. And that is a theme related to our good ag neighbor approach that I'm going to describe. And again, there are some important considerations with produce food safety, including leafy greens. And one is that the big demand for raw and minimally processed foods, not just leafy greens, but certainly you go into Trader Joe's and many of the items have a big, in all capital letters, raw or unprocessed or natural. And the days of Popeye with his can of spinach have changed over to people wanting fresh spinach, and they want it all year round, which means that we have a complex distribution system. And these emerging pathogens, such as E. coli 0157, have really low infectious doses. Early on, it seemed, what is the odds that one field could have caused a national outbreak with no clear gross contamination of event, but it's possible because of this low infectious dose and the potential for cross-contamination and even attachment of these bacteria to the leaves. And a quick mention again that for the pathogen pair with lettuce has been mostly E. coli 0157, but other STECs, Salmonella and Listeria monocytogenes, and Cyclospora have also been associated with leafy greens. But in terms of the adjacent land use risks, really we're focused on mostly the STECs and trying to figure out what is going on with these certain strains. And I also want to remind everybody these infections can be extremely serious. When you look at the billions of servings, I consider this a low probability, high consequence event. But when it does occur, obviously there's a lot of damage to the industry and confidence in our food supply, but also the individuals that STOP and LGMA have worked with to really understand that this is a very serious problem that needs to be considered. And that is something that it gets uncomfortable when we are going to the cattle industry and they feel like a finger's getting pointed at them, that they weren't directly responsible. But we've realized now, after a lot of meeting together, that everybody has a potential role, even if they're not under a regulatory umbrella. And again, this talk, unlike most of mine, won't be heavy on data, but I do want to point out that if you get on PubMed or you do a Google, you will find a lot of papers that have isolated E. coli 0157, usually rarely, but in some cases there can be spikes and a lot of different, it's very complex, and it doesn't always all go back to that smoking cow. Some of these strains might persist in water sources. They might transport by bioaerosols, composting operations. We've done some work with unfinished compost that show that can be another reservoir of these STECs. And we really don't see workers as being a major source because these particular STEC pathogens are believed to originate in healthy animals, and humans are not generally carriers when they're not sick. But certainly workers are part of this because of the equipment, as well as being the eyeballs that are out there, the people who are going to see if something unusual is going on that could lead to an outbreak potentially. I will say a little bit more though about cattle, because they come up in all of the recent reports. There is risk, even if there's setback. The picture in the upper left corner was before a lot of the setback metrics from the LGMA, but they're still on the hills. And again, this would be a typical summer photograph. Those hills are dry, completely dry, and there's no rain. So there's no actual runoff going into that field, but there's always the risk of loose animals. That's more likely if you're next to a hobby farm. And then at certain times of the year, they might be bringing those cattle down to work them and creating a lot of dust. And they may have, if it's a dairy or a feedlot or a composting operation, they may have stored livestock manure. And everything is outdoors. Even if they're indoors, wildlife are ever present and have that potential to move pathogens around. And a lot of different factors to consider. And wildlife can be the most challenging to manage. And we now have a concept of co-management where we balance natural resources with food safety practices and to do risk reduction. And again, we are moving into something like this with more coordination with the livestock industries as well. And it is a fact that cattle are a potential reservoir of E. coli 0157 and other STECs. And there is a difference between high density, such as CAFOs, feedlots, versus the low density cow-calf rangeland cattle. In general, we find a lower overall prevalence. This is data from over a decade ago with a large research study with USDA, ARS, and UC Davis. And we pretty consistently found E. coli 0157 on feedlots. There were a couple of feedlots in the Central Coast and a number of cow-calf operations with some seasonality. Same thing in Arizona, Imperial Valley. We did a subsequent Center for Produce Safety study and found around 17% overall prevalence with some seasonality. In the cow-calf pasture, what was interesting is that maybe a lot of these operations would be zero. We wouldn't find any E. coli 0157. And now that we're doing a vaccine trial, of course, we can't find any 0157 because that's the nature of research sometimes. But it's generally not that prevalent out in those rangeland cattle. But And what this is showing is a graph where in that study, we had a big spike that occurred in the fall of '09, and then again in the spring, and in water, and as well as cattle and feral pigs. And so you get these sporadic occurrences that are unpredictable, and that's what's maybe even more scary than a large feedlot, because most of the time those cow calves are not shedding, but how do you know when they are? And we're really looking at the seasonality of this and whether or not there is a time of year that it would be especially good to talk to your cattle neighbors in terms of prevention. Same thing with wildlife. There's a time of the year when the wildlife are going to be foraging on grapes, for example. We have a lot of vineyards in the Central Coast, and they are all intermixed with the row crops and the wildlife corridors and the cattle operations. They're all adjacent to each other. And so we're looking at how do all these interplay, because nothing is standing out obvious. Since 2006, we've looked at these same type of scenarios without a clear answer. And back in adjacent land use came up during that outbreak investigation. This is a Google map that shows what this environment looked like. It was more north of the Salinas Valley into the foothills, where you did have a grass-fed beef operation, low-density cattle, a river, a campground, potential sewage impacts to look at, lots of vineyards and rangeland. And there's a lot of different potential sources around these farms that aren't completely straightforward. And I just wanted to show this. This is from a review paper that I did a little while back. I think it's still relevant, but I became very fascinated with Don Schaffner and Michele Jay-Russell's JFP paper from 2011. It was a QMRA, take the data from the spinach outbreak and analyzing scenarios using QMRA, which is, of course, important to contact in this big question. We're wondering, so if you have some kind of a low introduction, because again, this is not gross contamination happening in those fields, say from wildlife or contaminated water or contaminated compost that got recontaminated, you got something that comes into the field. Is it plausible that you could go from that low level all the way to over 4,000 estimated illnesses? And this paper shows that from a modeling perspective, absolutely. And so each point along this continuum is important, including what's going on at the field and neighbor level. So where are we now in California with all of this background? Other than being scary to be a farmer, I think, with this going on. And yet, I think we're definitely making progress. And I think what I'm going to present is a potential model for other commodities, other geographic regions, and just really quite proud of all the colleagues out here that have put together these initiatives, also in coordination with the federal, state, and local entities. And just a quick highlight, some of these might be webinars someday. In terms of filling knowledge gaps in the big picture, we have a study going on called the California Longitudinal Study, CALS. There's a parallel study in Arizona, and that is, again, looking at adjacent land use and going over time to do multiple repeat sampling events, in our case on actual produce farms, vineyards, composting operations, public land sites, the Salinas River, and using technology such as whole genome sequencing and metagenomics to try to see what are the patterns and what is there anything with that seasonality that we can tease out. And these E. coli 0157 is so rare in most of these settings that I'm looking forward to seeing how metagenomics will help us, because we don't have high prevalence in the region per se, and let's say actual produce fields in plants or soil and water. It's actually a fairly rare finding. And other initiatives are to look again, is there anything that was missed about compost or soil inputs, treated animal-based manures or green waste or food waste? CDFA has an initiative working with FDA to look again. We think those are safe, but what if something was missed? And C. Davis is helping with some of that laboratory work. Also, the E. coli 0157 cattle vaccine trial using an already licensed product that's not in use, but looking at a niche use. And a lot more being done in coordination with Center for Produce Safety and this contact grant In terms of prevention, really that this California ag neighbor is jumping ahead. Even without all the science, we know enough that at least talking to our neighbors will help to discover what might be missing that we could already find without a 5-year study. So this is one of Natalie's slides and presentations. I highly recommend. She unfortunately was tied up. It's their legislative season, generously shared some of the nice slides she put together. And I love the reconnecting communities. And I don't know quite, if you weren't there, I don't know quite how to describe the tensions that happened between the livestock industries and the produce industries early on, with setbacks and just not a lot of communication of understanding what that meant, especially on the cattle side, and just a tremendous amount of work bringing. And California Department of Food and Agriculture is over both animal production as well as produce production, and so they were in the best position to bring people together. And this is very grassroots. Initially, we did some workshops in Southern and Northern California, but realized as things progressed, we really needed to start at a very grassroots level to see how this concept of good ag neighbors would work. And so because of the ongoing rep strain outbreaks in Salinas and other smaller outbreaks, the focus was decided to be on that Salinas Valley Central Coast area, which is actually quite huge. It spreads across 90 miles, and the valley sits in between mountain ranges and then on the ocean side, and then also going into the cattle country rangeland. As I mentioned, in 2019, we had those 2 workshops in the Central Valley and Imperial Valley, and came up with, we had a moderator. This was coordinated by Western Institute for Food Safety and Security, as well as our Western Center, and funded by CDFA. And it was pretty tense at first. It really ended up being a very productive, lots of good breakout groups, and ultimately, the information from those workshops was taken to create the California Ag Neighbor Dialogue Group and Steering Committee, which Natalie heads up with Norm Groot. Norm Groot, who I'll show a little video clip at the end of my presentation. He's the head of the Monterey County Farm Bureau, which gives this nice local perspective. And so these initiatives have very much embraced that concept and brought these different farming groups together. And with the California Ag Neighbors, it got launched right at the beginning of COVID. So there went our face-to-face handshake meetings, and we went to Zoom. And it was still amazingly successful, and bringing these stakeholders together in their Zoom boxes, but also having everybody discuss early on. Probably my favorite part of this whole concept that Natalie and Norm put together for the follow-up was bringing the people that are working in viticulture, the people who have composting operations, cattle operations, produce farms, and talking, what do they do in the spring, summer, fall, winter, what activities. That could be like, when do you bring the cattle down to feed them? Does that cattle movement bring any risks toward the produce fields? What are the vineyards fertilizing with? Are they using anything that could be a risk? Are they an attractant to wildlife at certain times of the year? And so we literally made a matrix with these discussions that went on to be a report, which I won't dwell too much on, but I will give you the links. This is a great template that could be used in different kinds of settings. For us, it was those particular ag industries. For someone else, it might be that you're in an area with a lot of hobby farms, or maybe sustainable farms that are doing practices like rotational sheep grazing. So I think the concept is what I really wanted to get across in the talk today. Now there's a formal steering committee, key industry, government, and academic partners. There's a larger dialogue group. We'll have a meeting coming up pretty soon, probably, and that is more broad with the larger produce or associations, the academic experts and other experts that have helped review these reports. And in terms of the resources, there is an interim report that's a lot of work went into. Again, I'll give you that link. The CAN initiative also has done a series of webinars that are available online. Early on, we had one about reservoirs of E. coli 0157 with myself, Dr. Rob Atwill and Dr. Gabby Meyer, who's heading up that vaccine trial in a cow-calf setting, and as well as looking at on-farm factors that could affect the STEC movement and so on. So a lot of this, again, was very grassroots, bringing in people that are actually working on operating farms and adjacent lands in the Salinas Valley. All of this, again, has been synthesized in the webinars and the report. And the next steps, which to me mean that there might be a season or a sequel to this talk with Natalie and Norm, saying what has come out, because right now they are actively coordinating the 4 top action items that came out of the report. And one was to foster this neighbor to neighbor interactions and conversations. Another was to build a research roadmap for the Salinas Valley. This is obviously being done in coordination with research with other groups such as CPS and USDA specialty crops and Contact. That's part of why I'm here today. And I know Natalie is on the advisory group, but we're trying to create those bridges and not reinvent the wheel, but find what did we get, especially out of those matrix and those meetings we had with the different types of industries. What do we have that we can share to enhance Contact and other areas of research? This will not be a funding group, I don't believe. It's mostly going to be advisory. And then the third would be to help foster creating a quantitative microbial risk assessment framework. Again, bringing together the diverse amounts of data that might be out there and looking at the power of the QMRA, which again is a big part of Contact, and getting something that we can't get by just taking samples all around the environment. There's only there's a point that we need to be able to model this data and make some decisions, because these pathogens aren't that common in the environment. And look at what are the risk factors, and what can we go back to the industry and FDA and CDFA to inform practices and policies. And then fourth, to build and maintain the capacity to move knowledge from research into the applied practices. And I think that's just keeping it going. It would have been fairly not surprising if we did the 2019 workshops and called it a day, put up the information on our website, and that was it. But this is a very active, ongoing initiative that I look forward to seeing more coming out of it. And again, just to summarize, it's a localized effort. There's always a place to have the large get-togethers with big trade groups and IAFP. But ultimately, the success of CAN has been to have the actual people giving true feedback of what's going on, boots on the ground. And again, these solutions are not unilateral. If you do a quick Google on romaine lettuce, articles will come up that are very much blaming cattle, as if that's the end of the story, which I hope you got an appreciation. It probably isn't the only part of the story. And then just watch. We can certainly make sure that any future webinars or information coming out of CAN gets to the Contact community and interested party. I've just a couple scenarios. I'm not going to give you all the answers, but just things to think about that we face in the Salinas Valley and to some extent in the Imperial and Arizona region. So here are some photos. You've got your beautiful lettuce, that is not romaine, but it's a great lettuce picture of leaf. And again, if you drive up into the hills a little bit, or even just look upward, you might see vineyards right next to you in a shared road. And on the other side might be cattle, also set back a fair distance, but certainly not leaning over the fence, chewing on the lettuce, but they are sharing roads and in proximity. And if, the other picture is actually from down south, more toward the Yuma growing area, Imperial Valley, where you do have some feedlots and dairies where you're going to need to remove large amounts of manure and bring them over for composting. And this is very true in our Central Valley too, where we have large dairies and some lettuce production. And that manure has to go somewhere. And we have big healthy soil initiatives in California, and sometimes a little bit of conflict there too, where Those who are really promoting good sustainability and good soil health really don't want to hear from the food pathogen people. It spoils the party. But the reality is that we find these pathogens in these manure sources, even during the composting process. And composting has become a huge focus to try to promote that and do it correctly out here. But basically, if you're a leafy green grower, there's a chance if you don't have just a giant amount of acreage that is just surrounded by more or more lettuce, just lettuce and lettuce. If you're in a more complex environment, which is often the case, then you may be having these neighbors. And how do you approach them without creating any issues? And it's easy until you reach the point of actually talking about, hey, you're doing this practice that might be putting my produce field at risk. So I want you to vaccinate your cattle. That doesn't necessarily go over well when the rancher has no benefit and does not see themselves as directly being a part of the problem. But we have been educating more in these discussions that are now much more friendly, neighborly, just why there could be a risk. What's going on we have a huge feral pig problem, and they absolutely get into the vineyards and then into the cattle ranches, and they might move produce fields. We have a lot of birds. We're right in the Pacific Flyway, and bird intrusions can be really frustrating. And again, they may go from a sewage plant or a composting operation over to the strawberry fields or lettuce fields. And so it's an ongoing concern of being aware of what's around. And it's obviously in the official reports. This is from the FDA's 2019 investigation that, again, caused a lot of upset because this cattle grate photo came up, which was in proximity to where they found which was actually where they found the outbreak strain. They didn't grow produce on this ranch, but if you drove down the road, they were growing produce down the hill. And again, there was no runoff, no loose animals. There's some wildlife, but not an overwhelming amount during that time of the year. So what does that mean? What does it mean that you found this outbreak strain in this grate, or even in canal water in Arizona? And so we have to go back to the cattle industry and say, what does this mean? How is this? Well, is there anything you could change? Can we say please, or might you? Or we don't want to waste their time either. And that's to the cattle 0157 vaccine. It seemed early on when we first mentioned this in the CAN dialogue group, some were really excited because wouldn't that be the ultimate silver bullet? But we all know it wasn't at the time because there was a lot of controversy with the COVID vaccine, which we know is not entirely effective and in all cases. And it's a hard sell. It's one thing to vaccinate cattle that are in pens in a feedlot. That's a hard sell for a disease that only affects humans. The cattle are perfectly healthy while they shed the 0157. So there's no economic incentive. You can't force them. I guess you could, but that'll really cause a riot. And so Gabby came in as a beef specialist in the vet school, and understanding that the hardship it could be for cow calf out on rangeland to bring those animals up and vaccinate them. And this vaccine requires 3 doses. So part of the CAN initiative and the funding that we had with CDFA was to use a university herd in the foothills that had cow calves and show the efficacy of the vaccine. Of course, the herd did not shed 0157 during the study after baseline, but Gabby will eventually be presenting some interesting serology data showing that it does appear to be effective, at least in terms of immunology. And the last part of this scenario is just, I actually live near this cattle herd, and I driving up, and I've seen this in the down south Monterey County too, where they have open range cattle. That means that you have those guards, but the animals are out on the road, especially if you're feeding them and the hills are all dry. In this case, they were moving the cattle down to the chutes in order for us they were doing preg checks and we were doing the vaccine. We were coordinating it when they were already bringing these animals up. And I could not drive without running over poop because they took the horses and ATVs and moved them through the road. And this is a public road. But what does that mean? I had gloves and a fecal cup, so I had to get the manure and test it. And it had STEC, non 0157. But could that cause an outbreak? Could it be dragged from a cattle grate down? Is there any shared vehicles? This is something I think came up in the CAN dialogue groups, just to either say, okay, this is an issue or this isn't an issue. But on a produce farm, there is a lot of vehicle traffic, a lot more than you usually see in animal agriculture. And this brings me to the final slide. I mentioned the term co-management. This was defined. Karen Lowell was really involved. She's also part of CAN. And this was when we had a lot of tensions about conservation, wildlife, supposed scorched earth in the Salinas Valley because of concerns about spread of pathogens from wildlife. And the truth lay somewhere in the middle. And ultimately, the way to find that balancing point was to follow this co-management principle of trying to minimize the microbiological hazards associated with food production, while at the same time conserving soil, water, air, wildlife, and other natural resources. And with that, it involved bringing in wildlife biologists, conservation experts, looking at doing a lot of research, which animals are highest risk, under what conditions. It's a big difference between a solitary green heron sitting in a reservoir near a produce field versus having a whole murmuration of starlings that are pooping everywhere. And so that was a good approach early on. That was also tough the way that the current situation is with cats. But I'm trying to come up with a new term, and I think Laura helped me work toward this one, but come up with a term and a definition similar with this effort that embraces the good ag neighbors. And that would be to coexist, because ultimately these farmers are all living in the same local environment. They're probably friends. Maybe they're in the same clubs and churches, and their kids are in school together, and they certainly don't want conflicts. What can we as food safety people to help promote and support the continued success of these different farming communities? And my last picture, I just had to because of the theme, which did actually in 2019 originate from the Mr. Rogers movie. Just imagine what our real neighbors would be like if each of us offered, as a matter of course, just one kind word to another person. And we actually have had a really good time in CAN and in the dialogue groups and the workshops getting together.
The core of anything is communication. And that's what has been enjoyable, is the dialogue that we're having. And it's been a pleasant, educational dialogue. I try to approach this as a learning experience. The fact that I can learn things from them, they can learn things from me.
Michele Jay-Russell, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I love the presentation. I think it's a really great program that California has worked on cooperatively with many different players. I think it's something that a lot of us can take as a case study. So thank you so much for joining us on our season finale. To the rest of all of you, thank you for hanging with us. We really appreciate it. Totally love you all. It's been a blast, right? The season. Cannot believe now we've done 2 seasons of this. We will come back for a season 3. Like I mentioned, we are probably going to kick it off with either retail sanitation or our root cause analysis or investigation multi-part series, where we are building a working group to tackle this. So you'll see some familiar faces that have presented before, but we're also going to hopefully bring in some of our FDA colleagues, which I'm really excited about. So anyway, stay tuned. We'll be back in the fall of 2023. If you have other things that you want to share, please drop me a line, an email. Alexis and I are always listening and trying to evolve and make this something that's really impactful for all of you. So thank you all. Take care and have a great evening. And I didn't get to say it, but may the 4th be with you.
Thank you.